Welcome back. Today we will start with lecture 4 of module 8. As you have already seen that this is the last module of the course, and in this module we are looking at the socio-linguistic issues from a slightly different perspective, and we are discussing some of the newer way of looking at social variables, the way the society or the cultural backdrop modifies or changes or impacts in either way, in whichever way impacts language choice, language variation and so on. So, we are basically in the domain of cognitive perspective, in the domain of cognition, where we are looking at the social practices, social variations of language from a cognitive lens. So, continuing with that understanding, continuing in that vein, we are looking at cognitive sociolinguistics today. This is a relatively new field. So, that has come up in the recent times, say last couple of decades or so, and largely the emergence of the entire domain has been credited to a few researchers. One of them is, the most important name is that of Dirk Hertz. He was the first one to suggest the name cognitive sociolinguistics in his plenary lecture delivered at one of the conferences ICLC 8 in Spain in 2003. So, that is basically when the field had a name, and he is the one who is credited to start the field. Of course, he is not the only one, there are other important names as well, but largely this is credited to him. So, the talk that he delivered was called usage based implies variational on the inevitability of cognitive sociolinguistics. So, there he talks about the inevitability, why it is important to think of a subdiscipline, why is it important to give it a different name in terms of while it is situated within sociolinguistics, why it is important when we are talking about language as a usage based paradigm, why is it important to include the cognitive there. That is how he talked about it, that is how he argued about it. Other names have also been suggested. So, social cognition, socio-cognitive linguistics and so on. Social cognition also we have covered in this module. However, this his coinage was considered most natural, and this has remained so. So, this is now the discipline is called cognitive sociolinguistics. So, this has kind of stuck. So, first volume this was carried out, this was brought out in 2008. It was edited by Christiansen and Derwin. So, this field actually has been handheld by a few notable researchers. So, over a period of time we have seen increased growth and importance in conferences within sociolinguistics, within cognitive linguistics, in both fields. We have seen the emergence of the discipline in a very steady way. So, third International Cognitive Linguistics Conference had given a lot of importance, and then the culture mind language culture mind conference, and then international conference of Societas Linguistica Europa and such kind of things. So, over a period of time starting from 2003, over time the field has got more and more importance and more visibility as well. And at the same time, high quality presentations published in the volumes, many books have also been written, number of papers. So, that is how the field has been established. Today it is an established field, and that looks at the cognitive underpinning of social variation of language. So, basically underlining the importance of the usage based aspect of cognitive linguistics. And this is more recently cognitive sociolinguistics was represented at the 21st Sociolinguistics Symposium in Spain. Thus, this is a relatively new field of research and that explores language by drawing on, this is how you can, one of the current definition stands. So, that explores language use by drawing on the convergence of methods. So, this is very important, how language is used rather than how it is in the grammar or how it is in the normative, but how it is actually used, that is the idea. So, language use by drawing on the convergence of both methods and theoretical framework typically associated with both cognitive linguistics and sociolinguistics. This is a very precise. So, basically both theories as well as methods are taken from both cognitive linguistics and sociolinguistics. So, this is a merging of certain aspects of cognitive and sociolinguistics, which looks at language usage and its variation. That is how we will take it forward. That is the working definition. So, it is a study of language variation from combined perspective of both social and cognitive constraints. So, these are the three important parameters here. It is variation, it is usage, and both the social and the cognitive parameters will be looked at. Both of them are important variables. In terms of his contributions, there are many. Of course, he is credited with creating the field itself, but this is how you can kind of list them. He played a crucial role in expanding cognitive linguistics by bringing in the social angle. So, within sociolinguistics, you needed to add the cognitive angle. Within cognitive linguistics, the social angle was added. So, thereby he helped expanding the fields. His research and that of his colleagues contributed to the social turn not only in cognitive linguistics, but also new research in cognitive sociolinguistics. So, not only that was because cognitive linguistics did not really take into account the social aspects so much. That is where his fundamental contributions come in, and then also he has created some entirely new area of research. One of them is lexical lectrometry. This refers to measuring differences between language varieties. It is a very fine tuned methodical approach to understand how the differences between lects as in dialects or variations, how do they work. So, there is a calculating method that he created. He focused on lexicon and showed that lexical variation can be treated as a sociolinguistic variable by subjecting it to lectrometrical methods to calculate the distance between the lects. So, how closely connected or how different the lects are, or that is the variations are, that is what can be measured using this lectrometry method. That is one of his most important contribution within cognitive sociolinguistics. So, now that we have understood what cognitive sociolinguistics does and where it comes from, let us look at the scopes and tenets as the scholars have put. So, loosely this is defined as that which explores language internal or cross linguistic variation of a social origin in its own right, or incorporates into it into an investigation with other aims, draws on the theoretical framework developed in cognitive linguistics, arrives at the finding by implementing solid empirical methods. These are important take home lessons. So, this is not this is an empirical domain. This is where you need, this is a data driven domain, that is what this means. Now, not all of the studies that come under cognitive sociolinguistics may have all of these parameters satisfying, but largely because this is still a developing field, there is a lot of flexibility that they that is allowed. So, something that is in the peripheral domain also can be even if this albeit marginally considered within the category, they will also be considered. Now, convergence between sociolinguistics and cognitive linguistics, this is what we are talking about. So, for example, certain variables that we have already studied in this module, in this course, that the social variables take us to the domain of age, gender, class, networks and so on and so forth. So, these are already there in sociolinguistics. Now, they are in sociolinguistics and now they are linked to categorization effects and stereotypes. Categorization is a mental process and cognitive linguistics studies categorization through language structures, and now when we are merging the sociolinguistics and the cognitive linguistics theories and methods, this is one domain where they come together. The social variables that results in linguistic changes, variations in linguistic forms, and that has also been connected to various kinds of categories in the mind of the both the society and the individual. Now, these variables reflect and evoke social identities organized in frames. Now, frames, the idea of frame is also integral to cognitive linguistics. Now, social identity is a social variable, cognitive variable is a frame. Now, how do social variables, how do social identities or let us say social groupings can be also understood in terms of frames or prototypes. These are notions within cognitive linguistics. So, this is now a new way of looking at the social variable using the cognitive linguistic framework. So, primarily the goal is this seeks to foster investigation into the socio-cognitive dimension of language at a usage based level, that is the goal of the field, and it is the attempt to achieve a convergence of cognitive linguistics and the tradition of sociolinguistics that we have already seen. Now, two of the important questions that here it asks, why would cognitive linguistics turn to variationist research? While he was describing in one of his landmark publications, there he puts the case of sociolinguistics, cognitive sociolinguistics, and there he asks these two questions. Why should cognitive linguistics need variation to study in the first place? Why social variation should be considered important for cognitive linguistics, and why would sociolinguistics bother about cognitive aspects of variations? And then he goes on to describe why these are needed, why these are important variables within each of these fields, and therefore he justifies. So, we will look at these two questions in slightly more detail. Now, the social perspective in cognitive linguistics. Now, predominantly semantic perspective of cognitive linguistics is what the starting point of all the argument is. Now, what does it mean? What does the predominantly semantic perspective of cognitive linguistics mean? It means that the cognitive linguistics as a domain of study started as a reaction to the formal approaches to language. So, the idea that the meaning is central to language rather than the structure, let us say syntactic structure, meaning is most important. So, you start from meaning and then go out to the structure rather than the other way around. So, meaning is central. How is it central? The most important or most let us say easiest way of understanding how meaning is central to cognitive linguistics is the meaning in sentences, meaning in words are equated, or let us say there is an equivalent of the meaning to how a group, a community, a people conceptualize a particular thing. So, conceptualization is equivalent to meaning. Conceptualization in the cognitive term is equivalent to meaning in linguistic term, and that is what the starting point or the point of departure for cognitive linguistics is. So, that is why we start with the argument that meaning is central to cognitive linguistics, right. And then the social nature, however, social nature of meaning has not been very popular, it has been established only recently. Now, this says that meaning is created and transmitted through interaction and not in isolation. Now, initially the idea was that meaning is there. So, what it means, what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of being happy, what is the meaning of being sad or whatever, the meaning is already there. Now, the social turn within cognitive linguistics makes it important, makes it an important notion that meaning is created in interaction. Meaning is often not static, it is dynamic. So, that dynamism or the changes basically of meaning comes through interaction rather than remaining static. Thus, viewing language not only through cognition, but as something that involves social and cultural contexts. So, it is not only in your mind, it is not only a part of your cognitive mechanism of conceptualizing, but rather there is an interaction with the socio-cultural context. That is what marked the social turn in cognitive linguistics. Secondly, the usage based nature. Now, a recent development in cognitive linguistics takes this position that grammar is not only a repository of knowledge that is reflected in language use, but the knowledge itself is a product of language used. So, the knowledge that we take for granted in language, in using language or the structure of language often is a result of the language use, the way you use the other people's intervention, addition and so on. So, as a result, usage based conception of language incorporates the socio variationist studies automatically. So, that is these are the two important turns in cognitive linguistics, in the trajectory of the development of cognitive linguistics as a field. that necessitated for us to look at the social aspect of language use. This is based on, so usage based is one, the other is the necessity to understand meaning in socio-cultural context rather than as a static variable. These are the primary two reasons for cognitive linguistics to look at language internal variation, which is the social variation. The language might remain the same, but depending on the social various social parameters, language might change. So, this is what we have already seen, and now cognitive linguistics also is taking this question seriously. Now, let us move on to sociolinguistics and why it should look at cognitive aspect, the other side of the story. Now, meaning, this takes us to the domain of meaning in variationist sociolinguistics. Now, variationist sociolinguistics we have already discussed, where we have seen that at the core of sociolinguistics lies language variation in the context of linguistic, cultural and social variables. These are the domains where there are variables, there are different kinds of variation that comes out because of these factors. Now, the very notion of sociolinguistic variable refers to meaning. You cannot ignore meaning, the concept of meaning, while looking at the variationist approach of sociolinguistics. Of course, initially sociolinguistic variation focused more on the structure in the phonetic structure, phonological features, morphological, syntactic and other features, but meaning is also there, meaning is also important. While we are looking at the meaning aspect of linguistic variation, there are two main concerns that the scholars have put forward. One is the variation of meaning, how language internal variation affects meaning. Of course, there are variations, that is this, the most famous case of understanding variation is how British and American English differs. So, is meaning also an important component in that understanding, in that comparison, that is one, and the meaning of variation. So, variation of meaning and meaning of variation, how speakers interpret and make sense of the variation itself. Now, this is where, because it is speaker domain dependent now, how people interpret them. So, meaning this is already taken to the domain of cognitive processing, as a result of which the proposal that has been put forward that these two domains should come together. Now, there is also a bit of understanding about why cognitive linguistics should have usage based approach, because it assumes that language does not only constitute a repository of form meaning, which is what structure refers to be utilized in everyday speech, but it is also the product of that everyday language use, and it is rooted in the experience of language users. So, this is where the embodied cognition aspect comes in. Embodied meaning, primarily it means the experienced domain, experience based cognition. So, depending on what you have gone through, what kind of experiences you have, you may add new meaning, or different groups within the society might add newer shades of meaning to a language variation, and so on and so forth. So, all of these are, so usage based perspective is also has also been underlined recently. So, this argues that language is experiential in nature and meaning variation emerges through inferences in usage events. So, these are the primarily the three different important variables or important parameters that decide, that was the background for creating this. Now, since we are discussing the dichotomies of various types, so let us also look at usage based versus rule based conceptions of language. Since the entire theory is based on cognitive sociolinguistics is based on variation which is dependent on the speakers. So, that is why we are looking at the rule versus usage dichotomy. So, usage based models argue that language structure emerges from a store of concrete linguistic experiences such as repeated use, frequency and stored exemplars. On the other hand, rule based models, rule based structure argues that language is governed by categorical abstract rules that explain exception less regularity. So, that is the rule based one, which does not allow for any role for social variables. So, many studies have been carried out. One of them, for example, by Cameron Israel, is considered one of the few early cognitive linguistic explorations into sociolinguistics. This study looked at the deletion and showed how usage based learning and entrenchment explain variation. Why is it the deletion, what gets used and what does not get used, has a lot to do with the usage based learning, where it is used, who is learning, in which context, and the entrenchment. The concept of entrenchment also had something to do with this. So, each encounter strengthens one form and both forms can coexist in the same grammar. However, encounters, depending on the kind of intermingling you have, the usage that you have, one form might get strengthened. For example, differences between rule governed and rule based and usage based phenomena reflects distinctions between phonology and phonetics. So, this is the rule part, where you know this is the rule of the grammar. Now, phonetics refers to the actual use of those forms, that is the difference. So, Labov argues that children acquiring phonology, which is rule based conception from their parents, later fine tune the phonetics based on the speech of their peers. So, rule governed is the structure, is the base structure, is the skeleton, but the usage based examples are what comes out of the usage, comes out of the interaction. Now, cognitive linguistics and sociolinguistics differ on the types of usage events they typically investigate. So, sociolinguistics collects data from predefined speech community through what we call elicitation experiments and interviews and observations and so on. On the other hand, linguistics, cognitive linguistics relies on non-elicited corpora to make generalizations about meaning and variation. Thus, sociolinguistics focuses centrally on speakers and their community and culture, while cognitive linguistics largely ignores the actual users in the social interaction. So, even when they are looking at the usage, this is where the difference lies. Therefore, cognitive linguistics proposes that social and cultural factors shaping usage events must be considered along the cognitive ones. This is a newer development, recent development, current development. So, cognitive sociolinguistics emphasizes on speakers, their place in a society and their participation in different community. So, these are latest developments, and it also focuses on the speakers' implicit and explicit attitudes and perceptions of the linguistic variation, because see, ultimately the end user for language is the group of speakers, different groups of speakers. So, it is very important to understand not only the rules of the grammar, but also the kind of interactions they have and the kind of attitude that person has. Not everything is explicit. In the society, various kinds of ideas and attitudes, ideologies, these are implicit, but the idea here is that they all seem to have a role to play into what kind of variations will ultimately be reflected in their language. So, there is that is where exactly the connection between the social variable and the cognitive processing comes into play. The result of this combination has given us the form that we have already talked about, the cognitive sociolinguistics aspect. So, this has been, cognitive linguistics has benefited from the addition of dimensions of external factors like age, gender and stuff, and by determining the relative contribution on such factor by the means of multifactorial analysis. So, this is one of the, this has been pointed out by many scholars that these are with the addition of such new variables, so social variables, now we have a multivariate understanding of a single component within the linguistic structure, cognitive linguistic structure. Conversely, insights from cognitive linguistics are allowing sociolinguists to show how the interrelation between language and society plays out at the level of the individual speaker's cognitive abilities. So, you see how both the field, both the subfields of linguistics have benefited from this coming together of both the theoretical construct as well as the methodological aspects of these two domains. Now, we will just look at some of the topics that are of interest within this. Remember, this is a developing field. So, there are some domains that have been well tested, some domains that are being tested using the theoretical and methodological perspective and so on. So, let us look at the variation of meaning and how cognitive linguistics and sociolinguistics looks at it. So, in cognitive linguistics, semantics is its foundation, and in sociolinguistics, semantics is ignored. So, properties of meaning such as prototypical structure and its flexibility are seen to characterize all linguistic structure, And here in the early studies, the phonology and phonological variations were given more importance. However, semantics has had a marginal status, and which is now changed. Now, even the idea of prototype has been taken into sociolinguistics to look at how even social groups can be understood in terms of the category formation and having prototypes, which has the social version of it is called stereotype. We will see soon. So, why sociolinguistics did not focus on meaning in the beginning? Because it was neglected due to the methodological issues capturing the complexity of meaning. So, variationist techniques required defined segments of language, and phonological and morphosyntactic variables comply with that criterion, because those days meaning the fine tuned mechanism, methodological tools were not there to understand meaning variation in that way as it was possible for phonology and morphosyntactic domains. Now, construal is a cognitive strategy, and this is studied quite a lot in cognitive linguistics. What is construal? In cognitive linguistic terms, construal means the different use of language to create a different meaning, keeping everything else same, but by just the choice of words or the way the sentences are formed, the way you choose to use a metaphor, all of these could be understood as construal operations. Thereby you construe a different understanding of the same scenario. That is construal in cognitive linguistics. So, this is the phenomenon closely connected to language internal variations. Now, this refers to a cognitive strategy of the speaker, alternate ways of saying the same thing when portraying or conceptualizing a given event. Now, when we are talking about construal, we are talking about an individual level. Now, when we merge cognitive and sociolinguistics, we can use the same idea to talk about the social variations as well. So, as a group, we might construe one event in a particular way or in a word in a particular way, thereby giving us a bird's eye view of the cognitive strategies employed by that group. That is what takes you to the domain of social cognition. So, meaning involves construal for the purpose of communication, which is the social cognitive reformulation of one of the basic principles of cognitive linguistics, as we just discussed. Now, cognitive sociolinguistics argues for exploring the socio-cultural foundations of the variation of different types of meaning by drawing on this particular idea. Basically, what I just said, that construal means creating different understanding or different alternate ways of looking at the same thing. Now, this can be done at an individual level, this can also be done at a social level, and when we are doing it at a social level, that is where we have social variation of the language. So, you see, this is where the cognitive and the social come together. Sociolinguistics, social structure is the categorization of people. So, people belonging to one group, one category. So, people, their relationships and social activities. So, social groups, networks, all this we have already seen. These are also categories. So, cognitive linguistics talks about category formation, categorization as process. Now, we are looking at the same process used in the sociolinguistic domain. Now, sociolinguistics aims to relate variation in language to variation in social structure. That is something that we already know. In cognitive linguistics, individuals perceive a social structure around them in terms of categories. When we talk about categories, we have some central example, there are some good examples. So, in cognitive linguistics, the idea of prototype is there. So, prototype is the central example of a category. For example, if I ask somebody, if I ask 10 people about give me the names of 5 birds. Now, the chances are if they are all from the same place, they will have more or less, there will be a large overlap in the number of in the names of the birds. But if I ask the same question to participants from another country, chances are very high that they will have a different list altogether. Now, this is what we refer to as good members or less central, less central or marginal members. In India, the names might be, nobody will put crow at the top. Typically, you will have myna and pigeons and this kind of birds, but you go to Australia or New Zealand, the entire list changes. So, what is a good example of a category is what we refer to as the central examples, and those central examples are called prototype of a category. Now, this is how you can also think of the social groups. So, groups as a category can also have central members and the marginal members. What this means is that the notion of prototype and construal, in particular metonymy. Now, metonymy, when we are talking about a category, when we are talking about a prototype, metonymy is a mental function. What happens in metonymy is that you refer to one object by using another object within the broader category. So, this is an idea from cognitive linguistics that helps us, and that can also help us understand sociolinguistic notion of variant styles and social values. Thus, sociolinguistic categories can be interpreted as prototype based categories, meaning having categories having good members, not so good members and marginal members, with some central and some peripheral members. So, in sociolinguistics also categories can be utilized as an important variable. The idea that has come from cognitive linguistics, this can be used, and as a result of which social categories can be considered as prototype, having prototype based categories. So, that is what. So, for example, style may invoke cultural models of speakers associated with those styles. So, this is the entire category. So, the style, the speech style, language style, that is marker, hallmark of a particular group, can be understood as having the cultural model. So, that group embodying the cultural model of a particular associated with a particular style. Now, let us look at the language, culture and ideology aspect within this. Now, the notions of culture and cultural models are significant in cognitive linguistics, and now it is also significant in cognitive sociolinguistics, because this is based on integrating the anthropology and the cognitive aspect of language linguistics. So, cultural knowledge often takes the form of cognitive models or schemas. Often we understand multiple things as having a schematic underlying representation. For example, the notion of source path goal, the SPG schema is an important notion within cognitive linguistics. Now, we understand various kinds of journeys using the same schema, source path goal schema. Now, not only that, this can also be utilized as the source domain for metaphor that deals with life or relationships or many other such things. Now, here this is the idea of schema. So, the basic skeletal understanding, schematic understanding that underlines a number of different kinds of manifestations of different kinds of activities, which can be understood using the same schema. Now, that idea can be utilized in terms of in cognitive sociolinguistics also. So, we organize knowledge is often organized in using highly schematic knowledge of recurrent topical domains, such as the human body as well. So, you have the warmth. So, he was cold, somebody who is not approachable, who is not very friendly, often understood as cold, or all of these. Even the emotions, various emotions are understood in terms of human body. So, the apple of my eyes, all of these. So, this is also understood as schematic understanding of various notions, cultural notions. So, here it gives two models in this regard. One is called the rationalist model and the other is called romantic model. Rationalist model is language as a neutral medium which supports monolingualism. On the other hand, romantic model talks about language being tied to culture and identity. Typically, these are more related to multilingualism, and these models remain central in language policy and planning. So, the idea of cultural model coming from cognitive linguistics being used in cognitive sociolinguistics can take this kind of two sort of representation that here it talks about in the models. Prototype, stereotype and semantic form, we have already talked about prototype a little bit. Now, here it talks about Putnam's conception of meaning. Hilary Putnam understands talks about meaning in terms of three important concepts: the theory of rigid designation, division of linguistic labor and the notion of stereotype. Now, here comes the idea of how meaning is generated in the society, not only in the mind of the individual, but it is outside in the society. So, in fact, he even has a very famous quote that we will get to shortly. The idea of the notion of rigid designation is where words designate the same object in all possible worlds. Wherever you go, the names he calls them natural kind of words which designates a particular thing and it remains constant anywhere you go to. On the other hand, division of linguistic labor refers to meaning construction application where expert opinion is followed. So, I might not be an expert in understanding something. So, I follow the opinion given by an expert while generating or using the meaning of a word. And then comes the notion of stereotypes, standardized description of features of the kind that are typical or normal. So, for example, the Arctic is cold, this is or some people are some certain kinds of notions, this is cold, that is hot, and this kind of thing. So, stereotypical understanding, some people are hardworking, this is what you call stereotype. So, in terms of meaning generation also Hilary Putnam gives us these three kinds of important notions. One of the most important one that we discuss in terms of cognitive sociolinguistics is the idea of linguistic division of labor. Now, what does he mean by that? This is where it comes from, the meaning of meaning, seminal work in 1975. So, he gives an explanation of linguistic problems like the problem of semantic interpretation. How do we interpret words, how do we make, how do we create meaning, and this is where the division of labor comes into place. So, he proposes this concept into philosophy of language as a sociolinguistic hypothesis, and this is how he talks about it. Linguistic division of labor prevails in every linguistic community, and there are terms the application rules of which are known only by a few experts, and thus these terms can be used by others only due to the cooperation with these experts. Simply speaking, sometimes we do not know the exact meaning of certain things. So, we look forward to somebody who is an expert. It need not be a scientific expert, but somebody simply who knows better. So, the meaning generation is not only in your head, but it is outside in the society. So, this is how he talks about it. Meanings just end in the head. So, through this argument he emphasized the nature of language that is determined by the world and the society, bringing it into the domain of social cognition. So, meaning Hilary Putnam's contributions primarily belong to the philosophy of language, but here he is talking about language, the generation of meaning, understanding of meaning, and the propagation of meaning. This sometimes there is a linguistic division of labor, because we do not, if we do not know, we take it from the others, somebody who knows better. And he gives this famous twin earth experiment where he proposes that there is a parallel earth somewhere, everything is similar, this is a twin. So, the name of the place is also earth, there are people in that planet who also have the same meaning. So, somebody who is called Ravi in this earth is also called Ravi there, but we have something called water in our earth, they do not have this water, but they have something else which they call water. Now, if both of them use the word water, do they mean the same thing? Now, we know in earth, in our earth water is H2O, but in their planet whatever they refer to as water has a different chemical composition. Now, when they are saying the same thing, when they are saying water, do they mean the same thing or do they denote the same thing? On the basis of this he talks about two kinds of meaning is constant, but the denotation is different, and the reverse, denotation is constant, meaning is different, and so on. So, this is where the idea is water with formulation H2O and some other formulation in the twin earth. Thus, referent of water varies between the twins. So, what is the referent of water in my earth is different from the referent of water in the other earth. Hence, the cognitive state of one person is not adequate to determine the referent of a term. This is what the primary idea here is. So, he argues that meaning is determined by the internal essence of categories, that is the natural types, which is he called rigid designation, and on the other hand there is also the division of labor, which is where we take the meaning from the society, the way the understanding is in the society. Now, based on these, there are two types of possibilities that he talks about. So, rigid designation, the theory is known as semantic externalism, and the division of linguistic labor is called the semantic deference. So, where you out of deference, out of respect to the expert, you take the meaning that is given by the expert. Now, if you take that these two parameters, then there are different kinds of possibilities that he talks about, but before we go there, we talk about prototypes and the stereotypes, because stereotypes is the third most important notion that he talks about after the rigid designation and the division of linguistic labor. Now, prototypes are psychological notions with an individual status, and on the other hand stereotypes are prototypes from a social angle. So, what is a stereotype is the social aspect of a prototype. This is how it should be, this is how it is expected to be, like that, that is what is a stereotype. And both of these are semantic norms helping us categorize knowledge. Now, if you take the semantic externalism and semantic deference characterizing a situation, then you have all of these three different possibilities that are there. So, plus semantic externalism minus semantic deference, where a society with universal high level scientific knowledge, there everybody knows the idea of the meaning of the whatever the concept is. So, as a result of which everybody has equal expertise and there would be semantic externalism, but no need for semantic deference. You do not need to depend on others for the meaning generation. The opposite is true for minus semantic externalism and plus semantic deference, where in a theocratic society, for example, where a group of people guard the holy shrine together with the linguistic taboo, common people rely on only those people to get to know anything within that particular domain. And then last is minus semantic externalism and minus semantic deference, both are minus. So, this is the case where perfectly homogeneous language communities of ideal speaker hearers, that is where it will hold. Now, there are of course many limitations that have been put forward, that have been discussed by multiple scholars. What is one? So, they talk about the gaps in his idea. So, the relevant experts are not always scientists. So, whatever we call expert may or may not be scientists. Most of the words in the language do not involve natural kind of terms and so on. So, there are conflicts that are also possible. The extent to which speakers rely on expert may differ according to the specific purposes and so many things. So, as a result of which conflicts might be real possibility. No society is so nicely cut and dried neatly. So, as a result of these, some improvisations have been proposed by many scholars, including Hertz. So, semantics of cooperation, authority and conflict, three-way the socio-semantic model as to how meaning generation is dependent on social factors. That is how to understand that there is this three-way division, the model that has been given, where cooperation. So, this is prototype based extension, authority, that is where expert driven usage, which is what the deference that Putnam talked about, that idea remains here, and the conflict that might arise, which Putnam did not talk about explicitly, is also now taken into account in terms of socio-semantics. So, there is an example, a rather famous example about the Bill Clinton's about the legal testimony of Bill Clinton, where the demonstrates how prototype based versus schematic interpretation of a term such as sexual relations can lead to significant communicative and legal conflicts. So, how the meaning was generated, how the prototype based versus the schematic interpretation of the same term led to conflicts, these all have been discussed, and as a result of which conflict is now interwoven in most of the models of socio semantics now takes conflict as one of the important parameters. This has to be there. So, such conflicts highlight that semantic flexibility can both aid communication as well as create misunderstanding, and flexibility, semantic flexibility is a hallmark of any communication for that matter. So, now these are also this has been talked about by others as well. So, cooperation, Bird's view also, where prototype based meaning extensions are socially acceptable as they follow the highest communicative norm. Then comes authority, involves compliance with recognized experts, and then conflict and competition occurs when semantic meanings or boundaries are questioned or contested. That is about socio-semantic relations, and this can be also understood through a nice diagram. This is taken from Harriot's publication. So, basically starting from the Putnam, and in fact Putnam and Kripke also talked about similar things. So, the how is meaning generated in the society, how meaning works with social groups, what are the connections between them, how does it work, all of these started from there, and now we have different kinds of modalities interwoven into the socio-semantics. So, to sum up, cognitive sociolinguistics is a relatively new domain. Primary focus of this domain is in linguistic variation and meaning, which are often understood as cognitive and social entities. It is a developing domain, and newer domains of research are also coming up, but we have to stop somewhere. So, this is where we complete this lecture. Thank you.